Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this event, which is really, I hope, really an event which is going to be getting us thinking, or getting us all thinking together, and the starter for a longer conversation. So it's designed to be kind of short and snappy with 10-minute interventions from our fantastic speakers, Don, Leah, and Anne. I'm going to ask you if you can put your questions in the chat, and then I will put them to our speakers, just because that means that then we can record the whole thing. Otherwise it gets complicated with permissions and everything. We're really pleased that you've come along to this, because at MMB, we feel very strongly that policy and politics and research are all interconnected when it comes to migration, and that this raises really important questions about the relationship between activism and research and institutions. So for academics, I think one issue is that, well, academic research isn't supposed to be political, but then how can that be when the categories that we use, like migrant and citizen, are actually unavoidably political? And increasingly, we're supposed to be policy orientated. And policy is often presented as apolitical, but again, as we can see with this field, it obviously is not apolitical. And more generally, I think academics in this field want to make a difference, and they want to make the world a better place, but intention isn't enough. And very often, I think academics are often felt to be either kind of ivory tower, really you've got no idea of what's going on in the world, theorizing and speaking complicated language that doesn't mean anything, or parasitically making a living out of other people's problems, coming in and doing your surveys and then leaving and writing an article, leaving the subjects of your research still struggling. But also for activists, I think there's a kind of shared issue with academics, which is that both intellectual work and frontline work can sometimes harden distinctions between migrants and citizens, because in efforts to engage policymakers, we use categories that emanate from policy and aren't of our making. So a good example of this is trafficking, which is really one of the few ways in which in many countries you can get support for, you can get help with supporting undocumented migrants. And I've spoken about academics and frontline workers and activists as if they're different groups, but also, of course, they overlap, and migrants are also themselves academics, frontline workers and activists. So that's why we're having this conversation about the relation between migration research and policy and politics. And we've got three great speakers. I'll introduce them now. So Don Flynn has been working in migrant rights since before he had a beard, providing legal advice at a community law centre in the 70s. And he worked for many years for the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, JCWI. And then he helped found and was director of the Migrants Rights Network. And he's written some brilliant analyses of migration too. One of my real go-to documents in the noughties was Tough as Old Boots, whose analysis I would say still stands. Leah Bassel is Professor of Sociology at the University of Roehampton. Her research interests include the political sociology of migration, intersectionality and citizenship, and themes that she's explored in England, Scotland, France and Canada. And she was also a jury member of the Permanent People's Tribunal when they held their hearings in London on migration and justice. And she's also done work on political listening. And then Ann Singleton is a senior research fellow in the School for Policy Studies, University of Bristol, and she's worked at the interface of migration research, policy and activism for 30 years, including being a State Watch stalwart. And we're very pleased, we're very privileged that she's also Migration Mobility's Bristol's strategic lead on policy. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We're going to start with, we're going to speak in the order of Don, Leah and Anne. So can I invite Don speak, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be part of this team here today. I thought I'd start off with something about the history of the relationship between researchers and campaigners, activists, whatever you want to call them. Because in my view, it has gone through a number of distinct phases, and the outcomes of this work has differed according to the phase that we're going in. And I'm going to do this at rather a rapid pace because of the amount of time. But going back to the 1970s and the 1980s, I think it's important to remember that there was very little going on in the way of immigration policy research at that point in time. We had gone through a period where immigration had just begun to separate itself off from race relations issues, with everything being the race relations side completely dominating the agenda. And also, it was the beginning of a long period of zero net migration. More people, right the way through to the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, typically in most years, more people were actually leaving the country than there were coming in. And it was very common at that time, I think, for people to take the view that the immigration issue had actually been solved once and for all by the 1971 Immigration Act. The politicians had come up with the magic potion that meant they could actually control immigration effectively and in line with their wishes. And of course, I'm talking in very broad brush terms here, and of course there were exceptions to that. The area of refugee policy, there was still very active work taking place, particularly in the refugees studies in Oxford and one or two other places. But by and large, I think even the people who'd been working on research, immigration research in the 1960s, and I recall having conversations with people like Robin Cohen and John Rex and Stephen Castles in that period, who were quite bemused to find that me, as coming from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and going on a trail around university researchers and policy departments and asking them what they were doing in the way of immigration policy. But they were quite surprised to find out that anybody was interested in this. They thought their best work had all been accomplished during that period of time. This began to change, and it changed in the course of the 1990s for a couple of reasons. First of all, probably the most earliest was the resurgence of refugee movements, which had gone up from a few thousand people in earlier periods, but the effect of the collapse of the Soviet Union and big changes in global relations meant that refugee issues were firmly on the agenda once again. But even what moved it all into overdrive, I think, was the discovery that the economy that had been built up to replace the old economy where people worked in industry, the service economy, was one which was once again producing demand for migration, completely unexpected as far as the politicians were concerned. And they were amazed to find out that in areas like service sectors, industries are actually generating large demands for migrants, and whole sectors of businesses had come into existence which expected this to be ongoing. And this fed into the new Labour policy agenda, which I think is probably the beginning of what we now think of as quite a productive phase of immigration research, where the slogan came up that what was wanted was evidence-based immigration policy. That there was an acknowledgement that the immigration was going to be continuing into the future at higher levels than it existed in the past, but politicians wanted to know how this was going to be handled, and they didn't know enough about it themselves, and they reached out into universities and think tanks of one sort or another in order to be able to find the answers for doing that. And the way that questions were posed during this period, very much in the way that Bridget has just suggested, with the things like the trafficking agendas and modern slavery agendas, it was a broader issue in those days. It was about managed migration. How do you marry up the demand for migration with increases in productivity and so on and so forth? But that was there. And money was being handed out at that time in order to be able to fill in the gaps. And it was a productive relationship, I think, because the researchers who were suddenly coming online in fairly substantial numbers during that period, also discovered that they weren't going to be finding the answers in any of the textbooks or the peer-reviewed journals that were available. It actually meant setting up research projects that brought them into close contact with the migrant communities and in the industries and the places where all of this was happening. And it ripped on at quite a pace. I think I associate this very much with the latter period of work that I was doing at JCWI, when suddenly there were constant requests to sit in on advisory panels for research projects, and even more than that, even to participate in the design of projects and to play a role in overseeing their development on in various types of work. Very, very productive. A new area of demand, I think, for migrant support groups of one sort or another, which we often found it very difficult to adjust to. One of them was the sheer length of time that it takes for academic researchers to actually complete their work, which is not a criticism. It's masses of evidence have to be submitted through, scientific methodologies have to be followed up on, and there's a whole peer review process underway. But it has always introduced a level of strain, I think, between the frontline organisations and migrant researchers, where what we tended to require was something which was very immediate. It addressed the policy discussions, pretty well addressed what was appearing in the headlines this morning, where claims and accusations were being made against migrants, and we wanted to know what was available to refute that. But we battled on, and there was an accumulation over time of a big body of work. And I think it's a snowball effect was taking place. The two, they were building up and supporting one another. Where has this got to? Well, the difficulty, of course, is that the evidence-based policy agenda hit a brick wall back in the noughties, when it's an evidence-based approach led to government taking a number of decisions which proved extremely unpopular with the public, like basically acquiescing to freedom of movement from Eastern Europe and other places. And there was nothing obvious going on at the research level which helped government to deal with that. So there was a huge pulling away from evidence-based research. I think government reverted to its old stance of wanting to come up with policies which were going to be appeasing public opinion at the various stages, and a greater reliance on focus groups and things of that sort, rather than the research agenda. And that schism has continued. It's gone into high overdrive, I think, from 2010 onwards. And this is my concluding point in the last two minutes that I've got, where there's effectively been a complete severance. The research community, along with other people, have now find themselves placed in a position of hostility as far as government is concerned. They belong to the group of lobbyists and do-gooders or whatever, who are trying to persuade governments and politicians to do things which their instincts tell them they shouldn't be doing, with the exception of, again, the parts of the government agenda where it seemed useful for them to dress up researchers complementing what they want to do with agendas like modern day slavery and the trafficking agenda. Where are we now? Well, in my view, that the evidence-based agenda is completely in the doldrums. We have now actually got to the point where confronting all of the evidence, from example, the Windrush scandal, with the numerous reports that have now come out, simply one after the other, and the very good popular accounts that have been written from it by journalists, like high quality journalists like Amelia Gentleman, and it has had, to all intents and purposes, zero impact on government policy. Government policy has taken the hit, it's rolled with it, and it basically continues with its line that we that all of this evidence-based stuff is simply lobbying, which is intending to get them to do things they don't want to do. My final comment is that but people are still there. The migrant groups are still there. The researchers are still there. The body of work has developed. Government isn't listening us to anything like the same extent. So what's really needed is to go back to that relationship to find out whether we can convert both the production of high quality research into building a platform which is capable of changing the terms of a political debate and making politics, forcing the hand of politicians so that they actually do have to concede the points that are being pressed for change. Now I'll finish at that point.
Thanks very much, Don. That was really interesting. And yeah, I've got lots of questions, but I want to ask people to put the question in there, put your questions in the Q&A. It will be easier for me to kind of manage if you can just put them in as they occur to you and as we go along. Can I now invite Leah to speak? Leah.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thanks for this wonderful invitation, and it's a real pleasure to share the panel with my fellow speakers. I want to answer the question you set to me, Bridget, of why should researchers learn to listen? And I'm going to talk about this not only in terms of why researchers should learn to listen, but how and what this does. If we think about listening as an interdependence of speaking and listening and the kinds of responsibilities that this can create. So I want to share with you my own understanding of this and what the implications are for policy-oriented work. And I'm going to be speaking from work I've done in 3 contexts, which are the UK, primarily in France, but in other European countries, and in what's referred to as Canada. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to focus on listening, and second, reflect on listening in relation to some of these risks and gains of policy-oriented work. And Don, you've set things up really beautifully and made really important points that I'm going to think about and try not to respond to in the 10 minutes. So just to start with, how did I come to focus on listening, and what do I mean by this? As this is ongoing work for me, but it started as a consideration of this social and political practice around what are referred to as the riots of 2011 here in England, when a young Black man, Mark Duggan, was shot by police. And here, for me, listening was a way to recognize injustice, to recognize that it was actually impossible to hear the young people who were in the eye of the storm at whatever intersections of race, class, and gender that police or policymakers or politicians had deemed to be problematic. So in response, I organized and participated in events that gave different space to young people from riot-affected areas. I wrote a report, co-authored a report on how young people are misrepresented in mainstream media outlets. And I explored citizen journalism as an alternative, a different way to tell stories, to tell one's own stories. And this kind of filtered its way back to policy spaces. It ended up being submitted to the Leveson inquiry into press standards. As I said, this has become academic work. But the main objective for me, and this comes to the kind of overlap with activist or active at least engagement, is that this was about thinking about how narrative resources could be distributed differently, how it might be possible for these young people not necessarily to be able to speak authentically, but to be able to speak a bit more equally, or to have a bit more control over their narratives, over the way they were telling their stories. And this resonated really strongly with other work that I'd done in Canada and France, where in the context of this work, one Somali Canadian woman expressed the problems of listening when talking about what she refers to as female genital mutilation, when she said, "I wish white liberal women would stop saving us. They only listen to you if you bash your culture." And hearing that statement and listening to that testimony pushed me to look at the ways in which debates over policies like secularism in France and the wearing of religious signs in state schools, the use of religious arbitration in Canada, really focused in a single one-dimensional way on people's lives in a way that I think is discriminatory, not considering intersecting barriers of race, of class, of gender, and of the production of legal status, border control regimes. So certain policies are seen to matter because certain aspects of people's lives are determined by powerful people to be the problem. So this has pushed me to be thinking about what a politics of listening is and what it means when some people are consistently misheard or unheard, and how things might be different. How is it possible to shift responsibilities, and particularly for people in dominant groups, to commit to communicative engagement on different terms, not on their own terms, on the terms of marginalized or unheard or misheard groups? That means changing the roles of speakers and listeners, but it also means a responsibility to act differently. Listening is not an end in and of itself. So for us researchers, why listen means placing ourselves in these webs of power relations, positioning ourselves. So this brings me to the second point, which is around some of the risks and gains of policy-oriented work. And I'm saying this as an academic working in a university in the global north that, as Bridget said at the beginning, requires showing impact of research. And as part of a community of researchers in which we're all very different. We have our own experiences, our own social locations and identities. We experience academic space as well as policy and activist space differently as a result of this. So we need to be mindful of these global conditions of knowledge production, how this knowledge is coming about, and who is and isn't in the academy and its inequalities, and how this shapes the ways we listen in the research process and how we're then heard, how we're listened to. So the politics of listening then that one might engage in as a researcher doesn't aim, what I'm putting forward here doesn't aim at formal institutions, at formal political actors to sort of improve responsiveness of government or to aim at changing policy per se, because that's a more traditional, I think, political and policy-oriented approach. And the reason I'm making that distinction is because of one of the risks of participating in these kinds of formally structured policy consultations. And Bridget touched on this at the beginning. It's really the risk of the ways in which the terms are already set. And you could very quickly become sort of unintelligible when you're challenging that frame. This can be performative. It can be a kind of way of managing dissent. The scholar Justine Lloyd talks about this as listening as a managerial cure. Well, we've done it now. That's that. We don't actually have to change what we're doing. And I think anyone who's had experience of giving testimony in highly polarized political moments will recognize these points very, very quickly, or anyone who's observed them or been affected by them. I'm thinking about work that I had the opportunity to do exploring people's experiences of becoming British citizens here in the UK and giving testimony in these formal structured consultations, like in the House of Lords, for instance, to a select committee or in formal local government spaces. And I think, again, there are questions here to think through around power and representation, around different forms of privilege, whether that's around class or around whiteness, around who gets approached to participate in these spaces, how different people get heard and then not, but also more widely, what can be heard. Back in 2017, even, for instance, it was very difficult to make the connections and to be heard making the connections between the hostile environment policy and austerity measures, or even the ways in which that category migrant comes to be when providing evidence about how the citizenship test is experienced actually as a tool of border control rather than an instrument of belonging and integration, and to propose abolishing this tool, even to propose abolishing borders, and rather than a kind of aim at providing evidence to improve the test, for instance, to change the questions or to present history differently. So you can see that as a space where formally those roles of speakers and listeners might have been argued to have changed, but the way that can happen on the terms of dominant groups, not a space set up on the terms of marginalized, unheard or misheard groups, but instead to address who and what have been defined as the problem. And this limits the nature of listening then, what can change, what action that will then be different. So my last point is to say, in answering that question, why should researchers learn to listen? This is not to dismiss any engagement with policy and consultations. There are really good reasons to undertake that kind of work. Policy changes matter for people's lives. Pragmatic engagement can be a tool to wider goals, but it's to recognize those risks and costs and inequalities, that those reproductions of power relations, and to consider alternatives. So a politics of listening then can be a way to listen for different types of engagement when those power relations of speaking and listening might be sometimes shaken by the unheard from the bottom up. What the opportunities and the challenges are of supporting activists who challenge policies, but also wider policy relations, power relations that marginalize their and our communities who are shared communities who refuse policy spaces. I mean, Bridget mentioned Permanent People's Tribunal. People's Tribunals is one such example. And what then changes in a more profound sense, different paths, but also different understandings of migrant justice in these power relations that we researchers, with all our differences and our absences, are, and those who are not part of researcher communities are part of. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. And as you were talking, I was thinking how, we've got this, I was thinking about the format of this event and speaking and listening and the ways in which actually kind of digitalization and the fact that we've all been reduced to Zoom has actually, I think, in some ways kind of really entrenched some of those speaking, listening distinctions in ways in which, of course, they were still there in our seminars and in our meetings and conversations, but I think there was more room for maneuver than there is very often on Zoom, even as we can speak to more people. Anyway, thank you very much. That got me thinking too. I hand over to Ann.
Thank you. I think Emma was going to help me share the presentation, if Emma's still there.
Can you share it? I can stop it for you, but I don't know if I can share your screen.
Yeah, sorry everyone about this. I closed it down because it was, I'm sorry, this is another.
This is what happens to me all the time.
We practiced this, didn't we? Practiced it.
Have you got the share screen button with the arrow pointing up?
Well, I've got
right at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then you should be able to select the window that you. That looks like it.
So yeah, so I'll start talking straight away, and I hope we can get this up so that it can everyone see that. At the moment, I can see all the slides. I don't know if you can see one at a time, but anyway, I'll continue. My question that I was given was, can research improve policy? And I've inserted migration policy. And my own experience that I often relate is that I've worked at the intersection of research policy and civil society activism for around 30 years, since the time Don was describing in the early 1990s, where we were within State Watch, we were trying to make sure that there was transparent and accessible information on what the European Union, the emerging European Union state was doing around migration policy, as well as many other issues on policing and civil liberties. I also started working around that time in the Migration Research Unit in University College London. And I was asked to work on migration data. And I had the impression then that all we needed to do was to make sure there was lots of problems with migration data, official migration data. So if we got all the problems solved, then we could inform policy, and the policymakers would look at the evidence and then they would make sensible decisions based on the migration data and analysis. So I spent 30 years working on that to discover that that's not actually how it works. So my question would be, on first starting with policy, who are the policymakers? If we think about people often talk about research and policy, but who are the policymakers? This term covers a lot of different levels of influence and power, different roles and remits. In one sense, in a democracy, surely the public and civil society should be the policymakers, but very often we're talking as a shorthand about administrators or senior officials. So my question, though, who should be the policymakers, also involves who should be informing the public debate and what evidence is required for a full, mature and informed debate. And that brings me to, then we discuss a range of policy problems. And the policy problems involve thinking about who's defined the problems, what are the problems defined to be, how are they framed, and how are different problems conflated in policy narratives. So the criminalisation or the securitization of migration, how is that conflation working in policy narratives? And then who's scrutinising this definition of the problem? So again, I come back to the State Watch type of work or the independent work, the need for independent monitoring of what's happening in policy. And then if we turn to research, who are the researchers? I challenge researchers to think as well about this so-called problem of migration and the way in which definitions and framing very often is uncritically accepted and adopted from using the policy narratives or the policy categories, and without a critical perspective or interrogation of the narratives that we're expected to address around gendered and racialized power relations. What becomes then the gaze of the migration industry? The migration industry is not just about the control of borders, it's also about the production of knowledge on migration. So we need to have critical thinking about the role of universities, of think tanks, lobby groups, migrant researchers, where migrant researchers are part of the definition of what should happen and where's the relative power in being able to frame what we're looking at. So who defines and scrutinises the definitions of the research problems and the outcomes? Then what is to be done about that? Disciplinary limitations, methodological nationalism are challenges. And when I should just relate as well, this morning I had or yesterday I received a message from a senior UN official who's quite annoyed with the way we've set this discussion up today, saying, why are there no policymakers in this webinar? And so I think many of us spend a lot of our time doing, talking to policymakers, doing what policymakers actually want from research. And yet there's still an anxiety amongst policymakers about why they're not in the conversation in defining research. So there's many misunderstandings. That conversation and that listening somehow needs to happen as well across many levels. So what do policymakers want from research? In my experience, they very often want answers to immediate policy needs. These are very senior policymakers. They want reliable data and analysis to inform longer term planning. They want legitimation of policy choices and actions which may have already been taken or that they intend to take, or they want to inform politicians about the necessity of taking. And they need tools to develop and promote policy aims. And now we see there's an explosion of work on forecasting, scenario building, nowcasting, the use of migration data to analyse anticipate what might be. These efforts have been going on now for at least 3 decades that I'm aware of. And very often, a lot of the work is involved in discussing why the previous forecasting wasn't accurate enough, or why the previous scenario building left something crucial out of the discussion. So again, there's a lot of work to be done there. And policymakers want from researchers briefings and information for public knowledge. But very often they want academics simply to carry out research on the topics and the needs that they have defined, and very often want a tame audience or someone to just supply reports that are going to be useful. So there is a tense relation between many policymakers. There are also some very well-informed policymakers who have been academics themselves or still maybe academics, maybe researchers, maybe migrant researchers. So it's not always that we all fall into these separate, distinct categories. But I think there's a critical gap in data research and policy, thinking at European Union level about the way in which European Union policies have not taken into account the context of global economic transformations, and still an over-reliance on national definitions of what are the so-called drivers of migration. So this language of drivers of migration needs to be interrogated as well in a critical way, which is really, it's just the latest version of what used to be called push-pull theory. So I would say we need to have a much more critical approach to how we act, the relation between the policy narratives and the research agendas. I won't go through all of these points because I think I'm already running past time very well, but these slides will be available. In my field, working on migration data, I've tried to look at, to develop a critical perspective on what is missing from the data, because I think the gaps in the data give you an idea and an indication of what's missing from policy and what's missing from an understanding of what policy is producing, the policy failures, or in some senses, policy successes that have produced effects that are harmful to society and harmful to migrants and to wider society. So the gaps for me include, although there have been enormous global efforts to improve the evidence base, we still have tremendous gaps even in the official data. For many countries, there's very few data available to even get an idea of what's happening. And there's need for more qualitative research data, and the need for migration to be mainstreamed across all national and international policy areas. So there are many policymakers that don't think that this is necessary, but I would argue as a researcher and involved in the policy world, that unless migration is considered across housing, transport, education, health, international development, it's going to be impossible to properly understand the impacts and effects of policy decisions. Hidden within and behind the data, I think there are inequalities in health, the impact of the pandemic that we see now, including mental health, of access to health services, maternal and neonatal health, all these issues that I've listed there. In particular, I think that the lack of information and access to data and information on what is happening to people in detention, the functioning of the so-called migration management systems is a major gap in research and policy relevant research. And those questions are not being asked sufficiently at policy levels to demand that the researchers, even if our job was to supply information for policymakers, we're not being funded to do that. And it's been left to the monitoring groups and civil society and migrant groups to do that in a broader sense. So if you think perhaps as an example about the European Union and the Mediterranean, the war on terror and the securitization of migration, we could say that the policy has created a permanent crisis, and we don't have sufficient understanding and analysis of how policymakers can be moved to move to a different narrative, a different framing of the effects of their policies. Do they really understand what those issues are? As an example of that, I've worked on some of the terrible, with an excellent team that produces the data for the Missing Migrants project. And one of the jobs we had was to calculate a so-called death rate of how many people die in relation to how many people leave the shores of the North African countries. And this involves talking in the language and calculation of, is it policy failure or is it policy produced harm? So this discussion around departures, arrivals, removals and deaths, that very many member states are keen to know what is happening, but that what needs to happen is where's the calculation of the human and social cost, the social harm and the societal impacts and the generational harm over multiple generations of what's happening in the Mediterranean on the land and on the and with the failure of the border control policies, even within their own terms, the border control policies are failing to prevent harmful acts and actually producing the conditions where harm is being created in this happening. So my conclusions were really that improving the quality of research and data is a contribution to, but not a substitute for, improving policies. We need to do more than have the a kind of the inertia that currently is happening, and this dissonance between research and policy. Better data, but unread academic reports don't necessarily lead to better policies. If policymakers are not reading the academic research, then where is it going? What is happening? Why? How do we improve that discussion? There needs to be more transparency, more reporting for public discussion, more accessibility for the data. I was in a webinar this morning, which was promoting a new way to present migration data on the migration data portal, which I think is a contribution towards that. But academics need to work more closely with the media, with journalists and with data specialists to improve public understanding and analysis. And to understand, especially now, how the impact of COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating inequalities and restricting movements of the global population. So I'll stop there, and I've got lots more to say. I hope that's been some help, and thanks for listening to me.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to all our speakers. And I'm sorry that you've all been given such a short time, but as I say, it's really to just sort of start having the conversation, really. Just looking at the questions, the first one was is asking, when policymakers or politicians ask for evidence or information, what do you do if questions are asked in a way that needs reframing or problematizing in order to provide an answer that actually addresses the critical issue? Do any of you feel that that you're constrained by the terms of reference that are used in research policy making exchanges? So I'm going to ask if you could just take a note of these questions, and then I'm going to go around and you can address whichever ones you want to make sure that we cover all the questions. So then the second question is, what about the press? So this is something you touched on, Anne. Shouldn't the press be included in the gaze of the migration industry, given its role in inflaming tensions and dictating public support or hostility? And then a third question is, do you think that quantitative evidence continues to be privileged by policymakers, or is there evidence, pun intended, of an appreciation of a wider variety of methods and data and inputs? And then lastly, how do we as researchers better influence policy if policymakers are becoming less likely to listen to us? So I'm going to take that, and actually I'll get a sneaky one in myself or a sneaky observation, which is, oh, I've just seen two more questions, but anyway, which is actually about no borders. So it seems to me, from my kind of time in this field, that actually academics and campaigners around questions of border abolition are much more prominent now than they were in the 1990s, and whether that's had any kind of impact on research policy kind of interface. I'm sorry, but you can set that one. That's just a thought. Sorry, there's two more questions comes in. Generally, migration policy is very focused on border control. So this is one of our participants' observation. Is there a way of shifting this? And finally, and And this person says, just a brief comment rather than a question, but hopefully it will provoke some reactions among panelists. I was hoping the focus of this webinar would be more towards acknowledging the political nature of migration research, and following from there, questioning our role as researchers in building the narrative around migration, instead of asking how migration researchers can impact and improve policy. It is, in my view, more urgent and more problematic to consider how migration researchers are complicit, together with policymakers, in constructing the narrative of migration as something dangerous and threatening, and migrants as racialized subjects. Does political academic work need necessarily to be policy orientated? Okay, so some very rich questions there. I'm going to first invite Don for his reflections.
Cheers. Yeah, that's a huge range of questions. Going through them as best I can. On the question, I think it was Yasha's question about the policy framework and the extent to which that influences the nature of a dialogue. The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, the number of times, particularly work from the standpoint of working for a migrants' rights organisation, where the piece of research that you're engaged in concerns a reply that you've got to give to a parliamentary inquiry or a Home Office inquiry of one sort or another. And you do find that it takes the form of a questionnaire, which you can see all sorts of presumptions embedded in it right the way throughout. And your every effort to formulate a reply to that seems to take you in completely the wrong direction, to a place where you don't want to be. And yet you still have to be there. You know, if you've been invited to attend some sort of parliamentary inquiry, you have to go along. You have to play by the game, and you have to do the best you can to stretch that in the directions that you that you need to take it. I mean, that can be a fruitful approach. It helps if you're able to sit down to work as a network with other people who are providing evidence, to agree a strategy for pulling that in the directions that you want to see it go to. And I think I've got a few examples of that, working alongside particularly immigration lawyers, going along to inquiries as members of the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, as well as people who have undertaken specific research in this area. So these things are possible. I mean, you have got the option of simply not playing the game, of turning your back on it and abstaining from the whole process. And in some instances, that might be the correct thing to do. But I also think that in many instances, it's not. And your presence and your approach to the issue is capable of stretching the agenda. A couple of questions there about how to influence policy, and also the final one, I think, about whether or not we're simply contributing to the situation by participating. I think my view on that is that this has become much more sharper over the period. I would not have said that during the noughties, during the period when efforts were being made to construct a policy which had something about managed migration at its heart. There was always a dynamism within that which had the potential to subvert it in one way or another. The key to the whole thing was getting the idea of migrant rights onto the agenda. It wasn't simply a question of addressing issues of economic efficiency and productivity and so on, but it also meant working with migrants as positive, creative forces in their own life story. It's become much more difficult, I think, in the period since 2010 onwards, when governments' big targets as far as policy have been put together in complete defiance of the evidence. For example, bringing immigration down below 100,000 people, utter nonsense from start to finish, and almost anybody who even remotely engaged with the idea felt that they were obliged to tell government that they were talking complete nonsense. And much more recently, with everything we've discovered with the hostile environment and so on. And I think it's very definitely the case where we need a number of projects and interventions which are designed not just around changing policy, but actually defeating policy, where we consciously assemble an array of research, activist, campaigning, communication strategy, which is out to completely stymie, destroy, defeat, and humiliate the politicians for having the temerity to argue in this direction. And why we're not there at the moment is something which puzzles me. I think the windows of opportunity have been thrown wide open over the course of the last few years on numerous ways. And there's a real danger that these windows are going to close unless we actually do start coming up with this. My final point, I think, is on the question of borders and border abolitionism and the prominence that that's played. And I've played a role in that. I've been keenly involved in various research activities of people like Neera Jubel-Davis of bordering. The concept of bordering has been prominent and working with that. But I do think we need to have a discussion about what the political implications of that, policy implications are. And I'm a bit more skeptical about the idea that it leads straight to the conclusion that we should be campaigning for the abolition of borders. In my view, it's an abstract set of propositions, which actually makes it difficult to engage with issues that are going on in people's lives in a really concrete fashion. And I wonder whether we ought not to be talking about the abolition of, for example, the Home Office in relation to its immigration function. The Home Office being a government department which is absolutely structured around the idea of regarding every problem as a law and order problem, and being able to throw the challenge at that immigration is simply not a law and order policy. It is completely inappropriate to frame it in that manner. And that in that case, and everything that we found during the course of the last few years illustrates the incompetence of the Home Office in working this area. But what we actually need is a campaign which is intended to prove the lack of competence of the Home Office and to demand that it's taken out of that structure. I think that would be an interesting project, which would have lots of very practical and immediate implications for migrant communities, as well as providing a very fruitful research agenda.
Thanks, Don. 18 months in and I'm still muting myself. Leah.
Thank you for these questions. I think our time is short, so I'm just going to choose a couple of the points. And thank you, because they're all excellent questions. I wanted to say something about the point on the press and the press being included in the gaze of the migration industry, which is obviously really important. And as Anne was saying about policymakers, the press is also not a monolith. And there are really important questions to ask there, which I had explored around that work relating to media and the riots of 2011 here in England, around also the extent to which journalists, particularly in mainstream media platforms, are in any way representative of the communities whose experiences they're covering and often misrepresenting, and the issues around the kind of closed shop of journalism and what other forms of representation, such as citizen journalism, can be fruitfully explored. And I think they're very good examples of those kinds of counter narratives, and it's a question of how they can be amplified and have more traction. The other question I wanted to pick up on was around no borders and these questions being more prominent now than before, and what is possible in terms of a research and policy interface. And for me, what becomes really important is the context in which those conversations are located. So I'm thinking about the differences between what I observe here in the UK and in the country that's referred to as Canada, where there are important forms of mobilization organization around No One is Illegal that center Indigenous sovereignties and that move away from movements for no borders because of that centering of Indigenous sovereignty, to instead question the legality of Canada and the sovereignty of Canada to determine border policy. So that's a kind of listening between activists. And what that would then require in terms of research policy interface is a much wider horizon of what justice means when migrant justice is developed in solidarity with justice for Indigenous peoples, meaning a whole recognition of nation-to-nation sovereignty as opposed to a reconciliation within the settler colonial state. So I'm just bringing those points to bear because there are perhaps similar reflections and comparisons to make with these questions in the European context, and these histories and these solidarities among activist groups are really, really important in terms of challenging those narratives. In which, as the last person's question and comment indicated, in which there is that real danger of complicity and collusion. And that was what I was addressing in my presentation, especially when I was talking about the ways in which there isn't actually control over the terms and parameters, particularly of these formal consultations, and that there are other alternatives that one could listen for and participate in and position yourself around, whether that's supporting activist groups, that may be groups that one is already active and an activist within. I'm thinking also about work I've been doing with Akugo Emejulu on the activism of women of color across Europe, and the ways in which, for the activists that are in our work, it doesn't make sense to talk just about migrant justice and migration, because those issues can't be separated from austerity and from the rise of the far right. So again, defining those projects very easily can fall into that kind of policy narrative that doesn't recognize those histories of racialization and production of gender hierarchy and class hierarchies and legal status hierarchies, but the ways in which also even within activist communities, these contestations are alive and well. And there's an important role then, not just about not orienting toward policy, but also about thinking about the politics and power relations within activist communities, because certainly the results of our study and the findings of our work indicate real problems and challenges of domination and exclusion and burnout and pessimism on the part of women of color activists. So that's, I think, a wider challenge than it's been presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. I mean, I guess one of the points is that we are all woven into these power relations, and none of us can escape. None of us can escape these sort of power and the power and the domination. But we can recognize it, and we can seek to undermine it. But we're not innocent of it. Anne. And Anne, could I just ask you to deal with this one question that hasn't been responded to about data and about policymakers being open to other forms of research specifically?
Yeah, if I take that first, I think policymakers that I'm in touch with anyway are very open now to analysis using qualitative data, but less able to fund it. So there may be individuals who you work with who understand the importance of different types of knowledge and understanding and framing, but there's also an issue around who makes the decisions over the funding. And I think that brings me on to also the question around somebody in the question and answers Q&A was disappointed we hadn't addressed more fundamental issues around policy. What's the role of researchers? And I view the whole issue around migration policy and migration as being one that is produced by states with a legacy of empire. The way in which the state controls the movement of people has problematized migration in itself. It's not researchers who have created this material reality that people have to negotiate. We may be complicit in some of the reinforcing some of the narratives, and we need to critically assess that. But I think we need to understand as well that there's a need to challenge state formations and the state production of harm, and not to distinguish between migration as a completely separate field and then accept perhaps migrants as some different group of people. I think we need to see it all in the round of how harm is produced and how societies are created as unequal and how inequalities are being exacerbated. And so in that sense, having different ways of understanding and framing our discussions around human mobility means that, yes, we should be actually setting the agenda of what is the knowledge production, that what is needed to understand how human beings are moving around or not moving around, the impacts on society of policy measures and implementation of those measures. I have one more point to make. Oh yeah, about the journalists. I think without journalists, a lot of the harms that have happened would not have come to the light. So there are journalists, and the main issue there is about the control of the media and the way in which media output is controlled. But actual investigative journalists have played a tremendous part and a courageous part in exposing what's happening. So I think we all need to kind of collaborate together with academics, researchers, progressive policymakers, people in the policy field who see the issues, and people who are the recipients of the policies, to say what needs to happen to define what we want from society, what everybody wants from society. And if it's possible to no longer use the term migrant, I think that would mean we'd have to have abolished the term nation state, the reality of the nation state and borders. And I don't think that's going to happen. Sorry, that's not answered it all.
There we get to the fundamental question. And on that bombshell, so thank you very much, Anne and Leah and Don, and thanks Emma for managing it behind the scenes, and Emily too, who wasn't able to be here. I'm sorry to the last two Q&A people, we didn't have time to get around to your questions, but hopefully that shows that there's a lot here to talk about, and together with Anne, we will think about how to take this kind of conversation forward. So thanks very much, everybody, and see you at another event. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.